So you're starting your new flying experiences and you're having this amazing time and this whole world has opened up to you. In the midst of all this newfound freedom, you're also been presented with an amazing amount of information and regulations that you can barely wrap your head around. One thing that I found difficult when I got into aviation was relatively how unstructured the learning can be. All at once, you're presented with every single document that could be out there. There's a mountain of information, and not very often is there a clear guide on how to navigate the ravines and peaks of modern aviation. This video, and hopefully more to follow, will make some elements of that easier to understand. Starting with, if you can see, instrument approach plates. Put it up here. An instrument approach plate is a diagram that allows a pilot to fly IFR, or instrument flight rules, in the clouds, or i.e. non-visually, and approach safely to the intended landing zone. In a later video, I'll go over how an approach is typically flown, but to start, we'll go with the basics right now, how to read an approach plate. For an example, let's use ILS or localizer runway 2 plate to Richmond International. When reading an approach plate, it's easier to break it into 4 parts. The first is information about the approach. The second is frequencies that you could need for flying into the terminal environment and at the terminal environment. The third is visual representations of your approach, both from a profile view and a plan view. There's also a depiction of the airport environment to familiarize yourself with what you're flying into, typically depictions of your missed approach instructions. Finally, there are your lines of minima, which are based off your approach speed or VREF. So we'll dive into this plate and look at how it would look to fly or read the plate that you're going to fly. First, I would look at the plate and dates to make sure that it is current. At least from the time that I started this video, so let's go ahead and say that it is. Next, I would look at the navigation. From this, we can gather that the localizer channel is 110.9 and that the approach course that you will fly in on your final approach segment is 023. It's worth noting, and would require a whole video by itself, the distinction of where you're pulling your distance information from. But for the sake of brevity, we look down at the different points and notice that they are stating that their information is based off the Richmond VORTAC. Next, we see runway information, for which many heavy aircraft use is extremely vital, as their takeoff and landing data, or TOLD, is predicated on this. Next section that we'll look at is essentially our warnings, or the T in the upside down triangle at the top is called a trouble T, and it means that there are restrictions that we will want to reference flying this approach regarding obstacles and hazards approaching the runway environment. For this approach, there aren't any alternate minimums. If there were, it would appear as a inverse A in the same box, and it would be something you would want to reference if you were going to be flying this approach or to this airport as an alternate due to weather constraints. But in this case, there's not, so there's nothing we need to reference right now. The next box over shows the type of lighting system that this approach has installed. In this case, Mauser lighting. The next box then shows our missed approach instructions. This is something you definitely want to chair fly, as often this can easily be overlooked thinking that you're not going to go missed. But the next second you're at minimums, you have no runway in sight, and what could have been a simple maneuver now is a compressed and complicated and stressful adjustment to your plan. In this event, you would go missed, climb to 2000 MSL while following the RIC 018 radial. Then you would reach the EPIC's GPS waypoint, which is co-located at 17.3 DME and a right-hand holding pattern until further instruction from approach. While not super complicated, can be a little more. in depth when you're having to do it on the fly. Next come the frequencies. These are straightforward and very helpful. This gives you valuable information of what the ATIS channels are for weather, approach for the terminal area, tower for the airport environment, and ground for taxi clearances and clearance delivery for your flight plan clearances. The frequencies shown here shows that there's also a UHF and VHF, so ultra high frequency and very high frequency channels, which will lend you some special situational awareness on the range out you can get them, because UHF will reach further than VHF. Moving on to the visual representations of the approach, largest of all, there's the plan view. This is an excellent tool to visualize what you'll be flying. It shows from above the orientation with the north to the top and south at the bottom of the page. And it's going to show the track that you will be flying, along with labels to different fixes on the approach, and in this case the different navigational aids that you might use. If you're wondering what the gray is on the plates, that's how water shows up on plates. In this case, the James River occurs right before the final approach fix or final segment of the approach. So if you were VMC, then you'd be able to use that as SA to know where you are. If there are mountains on the approach, they appear in the color orange. They should be taken very seriously, such as in this approach to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which parallels the Grand Tetons. As a quick example, before going back to the Richmond plate, you'll see this barb going on a thick bolt line going outbound to the 322. If you're planning a procedure turn, the side with the barb is the maneuvering side. This is a perfect example of why you have a maneuvering side. In this case, you would want to make your turns to the left, because if you turn to the right, you would be dangerously close to going towards the terrain. Moving now to the profile view back at Richmond, you get some vertical information. This includes the altitudes you're cleared to when you're on the procedure turn, the final approach fix altitude, glide slope angle, threshold crossing height, distances between the different fixes, missed approach navigation fixes, and then also very importantly what DME you would read when you reach the runway, in this case 0.5 DME. As you can see, the final approach fix altitude is recognizable by the Maltese cross, and this is at 2000 MSL on this approach. This is if you're flying the localizer. If you're flying the ILS, this location is where the glide slope following a 3-degree angle crosses the final approach fix, indicated by the lightning bolt connecting the fix and the altitude. I won't get into the differences between a ILS and a localizer right now, since that's another video to reel you back in sometime, but from the glide slope fix or a final approach fix, there's a shaded region. That means that the area has been deemed obstacle-free on a 3-degree approach by the instrument Terps gods. But again, that's a whole nother subject to itself. Finally, on the dashed line is your missed approach point, which you can see is not at the runway approach end. The last visual diagram is the airport diagram. This will be great for building your situational awareness as to what you should see when you become visual following an instrument approach. Easily identifiable is the tower and the beacon with the star, the P for the PAPI lights, and the lighting markings. Also on the top you'll see the inverse D, which means that there are declared distances, which ties into the toll that I mentioned earlier. At the bottom is the timing that you would need if you were flying the localizer approach from your final approach segment to your missed approach point to know when you actually need to go missed. We're almost there. It's a lot of information crammed into not a lot of space. Finally, there's the lines of minima. For this situation, let's read left to right on the ILS. We have our decision height, which is a barometric height that if we don't have any of the runway approach lights in sight, we have to go missed approach. Next, we have the visibility. This is a 3/4 statute mile, which is the minimum that has to be met for us to actually begin the approach. If the visibility from ATIS wasn't above this, then it's not legal for us to begin the approach. Next, 296 is our height above touchdown. Surprisingly, the world isn't flat, and terrain changes. So when you're at 457 barometric feet in altitude, you're actually 296 feet above the ground, the touchdown zone. Next is our AGL altitude, correlations to our minimums rounded up. If the clouds are not above that number, there's a good chance that you won't become visual and you won't be able to land. The last thing before we finish is the inverse C on the circling minimums. That means that the circling minimums use the updated criteria and take into account the effective altitude on true airspeed and changes that are allowable depending on the circling radius for different category of aircraft based on the speed. So now let me give an example if I was briefing this approach to the crew. There would be traditionally a more in-depth study while at altitude or even before you go flying of the approach where you go through anything that might come up to you, but then there's the nitty-gritty that you can brief in the plane. But always, if you need to go in depth and talk about it more, that's never a bad thing. So looking at this, let's say we're flying the ILS to runway 2 at Richmond. Currently, today's date is 22nd of February, so this is valid from 22 February 2024 to 21 March 2024, so I know that this is valid. We'd be flying in on 110.9 localizer, approach course of 023. We've got 6,607 feet. Touchdown zone elevation is going to be at 161. There's trouble T's, which we would have already referenced and wouldn't be a problem. We'll be coming in looking for Mauser lighting. Miss approach instructions, climb to 2000 RIC 018 to Epix interception, Richmond 17.3 DME and hold. Gonna go ahead and grab ATIS at some point, then it'll be probably 26.3.025 if we're a long way out. We have Potomac approach for our SA there in Richmond Tower, but also we will be given those numbers, but we can go ahead and spin them in to whatever radio communication that you're gonna use, so that as soon as they tell you to transfer, you can just hit it and be ready. Looking at the approach, we're going to come in, if we were just coming into an initial fix and not flying the actual procedure turn in here, come into an initial fix at KC. Initial fix altitude is going to be from 4,600 down to 2,000. Once we're cleared the approach, we're going to be on 2,000 coming inbound for 023. We're going to be grabbing DME just for SA off of the 6 miles, or it will be 6 miles at the glide slope intercept from the Richmond VORTAC. Going to be at 2,000 at that, then continue down on to our decision height of 457. At our decision height, when we're coming in, we should be coming to the left runway, so we should see another runway 34 off of our right. Then we should see most of the ramp and the airport environment, and then tower off to our left. Whew, we made it. That was a lot of information, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding on actually how to read these plates. Something that I wish somebody had taken the time to go through with me when I started. Now, it should be noted that all of this should be backed up by your own study, as this is only an aid, but I just want something out there that's, potentially just helpful for somebody who's getting started. If you like this, please consider subscribing. Tell me what you want to see, and I'll try to make those videos, and I want to make more that have some of those just foundation lessons about aviation and some other stuff. But yeah, consider subscribing, tune in, and see ya!